Our story opens under the scorching Egyptian sun of the early 1920s, when the air was thick with sand and mystery, and the Valley of the Kings still murmured with secrets waiting to be unearthed. This was not yet the era of high-speed archaeology with drones and satellites. No, this was a time when every clink of a shovel and every brush of a trowel might reveal some forgotten splinter of the divine, when Egyptology was as much an act of romance and obsession as it was of science. The world had become enamored with ancient Egypt, its pantheon of gods with animal heads and cosmic duties, its hieroglyphs that whispered across millennia, and its pharaohs who had defied time by building eternal monuments to themselves. Western fascination with Egypt had been growing ever since Napoleon's expedition brought the Rosetta Stone to light, and by the early 20th century it had erupted into a full-blown mania. Everywhere, from London drawing rooms to New York storefronts, Egyptian motifs danced on jewellery, wallpaper, architecture. Archaeological digs were not simply scholarly pursuits, but high-stakes adventures, often bankrolled by aristocrats seeking immortality of their own through the treasures of the dead. Among them stood George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a man as colourful as any character in a Gothic novel. A lover of fast cars and high-stakes gambling, Carnarvon had once survived a devastating automobile accident in Germany that left him with lifelong injuries and a restlessness that no mere estate management could satisfy. With a limp in his gait and an appetite for excitement, he turned to Egypt, where sand-covered ruins and whispers of gold beckoned to the romantic and reckless alike. He began funding excavations in the Valley of the Kings, the famed necropolis of Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs, hoping his money might lead to a find worthy of legend. But to search the valley, Carnarvon needed a guide. Not just any guide, but someone with an almost pathological obsession with finding what others could not. That man was Howard Carter. Born in London in 1874, Carter was the son of an artist and had no formal education in archaeology. What he did have, however, was grit, intuition, and an almost clairvoyant sense of where the ancient dead might be hiding. He had first travelled to Egypt as a teenager and had worked his way up from copying tomb decorations to directing excavations. Carter was as dogged as he was irritable, often clashing with colleagues and patrons alike. But he had an eye for detail and a tireless devotion to his craft. By 1914, Carnarvon had hired Carter to oversee his digs in the Valley of the Kings. For years they unearthed nothing but fragments, bits of pottery, broken tools, the detritus of tombs long plundered. The valley had been picked over so thoroughly by previous archaeologists and tomb robbers that few believed anything of value remained. Carter, however, had a hunch born from studying ancient records and the layout of the tombs already discovered. He believed that the tomb of one pharaoh, Tutankhamun, remained unfound, hidden beneath the very rubble left by earlier excavations. Tutankhamun was a relatively minor king by historical standards. He ascended the throne as a child around 1332 BCE and died mysteriously at around 19. His reign was brief, his accomplishments few, and his name nearly forgotten, erased by successors eager to distance themselves from the religious chaos of his father, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. For Carter, that obscurity was a blessing. A forgotten king meant a tomb perhaps spared from centuries of looting. Still, by 1922, even Carnarvon's patience was wearing thin. He had funded Carter's work for nearly a decade with no major discoveries. He was ready to call it quits, but Carter pleaded for one final season, one last chance. Carnarvon relented, and that, as the story goes, made all the difference. On the morning of November 4th, 1922, a member of Carter's team, often said to be a water boy, stumbled upon a carved stone step while preparing the area for excavation. Carter, called to the scene, knew instantly what it could mean. With trembling precision they began to dig, revealing a staircase that descended into the earth, cut into the limestone like a whisper from the past. At the base they found a sealed doorway bearing the unmistakable cartouche of Tutankhamun. The seal was intact. The tomb, against all odds, had not been opened in over 3,000 years. Carter, ever the cautious professional, ordered the site, reburied and sent a telegram to Carnarvon, who was in England recovering from an illness. The message was terse, restrained, almost maddeningly British in its understatement. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival, congratulations. Carnarvon wasted no time. He boarded a ship bound for Egypt, accompanied by his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. It would be weeks before he arrived, and the tomb sat undisturbed beneath the desert's watchful eye, its secrets intact for a little while longer. Finally, on November 24th, 1922, Carnarvon arrived in the valley. Carter led him down into the ground through the cleared corridor to the sealed doorway. Together they chipped a small hole in the plaster and inserted a candle. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Carter peered inside. His eyes adjusted to the dim flicker of flame, and he saw gold everywhere. Gold. Sculptures, furniture, shrines, chariots, all covered in gleaming gold leaf, crammed into the chamber like treasure in a pirate's hold. Carnarvon, nearly beside himself, asked, "Can you see anything?" And Carter, his voice perhaps barely able to contain the awe he must have felt, replied, "Yes, wonderful things." Over the next several weeks, the tomb was methodically excavated. There were 4 rooms in total, one of them containing a sealed burial chamber. Inside lay a nested series of shrines and coffins, culminating in a solid gold sarcophagus that held the mummified remains of Tutankhamun himself. The boy king, unknown and forgotten, had been entombed with the wealth of an empire. But it was not just the gold that dazzled. There were ceremonial weapons, thrones, chariots, musical instruments, statues, perfumes, foodstuffs, and inscriptions. So many inscriptions, each one a message from a vanished world, a whisper from the dead. Newspapers around the globe exploded with headlines. The discovery was hailed as the greatest archaeological find of all time. Egyptomania reached a fever pitch. Jewellery, fashion, even furniture were suddenly reimagined through a pharaonic lens. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a piece of the mystery. And then something else began to happen. Something darker. On March 5th, 1923, just a few months after the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo. The cause of death was an infected mosquito bite on his cheek that became septic following a razor cut. A freak occurrence, yes, but not an unheard of one in a region where antibiotics were still a dream. Still, the timing was uncanny. The press pounced. One London paper ran the headline, "The Curse of the Pharaohs." Rumours flew that a curse had been inscribed on the tomb's door, warning of death to intruders, that a cobra, symbol of Egyptian royalty, had killed Carter's pet canary, that all who entered the tomb would meet a similar fate. The legend of the mummy's curse had begun, and it would only grow stronger with time. But for now, let us linger at the threshold of that tomb, amid the swirling sands and breathless excitement, as the ancient world prepared to speak once more, and perhaps, in ways no one quite expected, to bite back. As the feverish buzz of international headlines rippled outward from the sands of Egypt to the salons of London and the newsstands of New York, the Valley of the Kings braced itself for the whirlwind that would follow the extraordinary discovery of Tomb KV-62. Though the world saw flashes of gold and the glint of ancient splendor in photographs and headlines, few could comprehend the painstaking, almost reverent process by which the tomb of Tutankhamun was to be unwrapped from its silence. Howard Carter, for all his gruff manner and prickly temper, approached the tomb like a man entrusted with a sacred rite, rather than a mere archaeological site. In an age when tombs were often ripped open with little regard for preservation, Carter stood apart for his meticulousness. The tomb was carved into the bedrock of the Theban cliffs, a relatively modest construction compared to the grand palatial tombs of other New Kingdom pharaohs. KV-62 consisted of 4 primary chambers: the antechamber, the annex, the burial chamber, and the treasury, each sealed and packed with objects arranged not for display but for function in the afterlife. The antechamber was the first space entered after the sealed doorway, a cluttered space that had once been carefully organized but now showed signs of ancient disturbance, perhaps by tomb robbers who had entered and been driven out early in antiquity. Here lay dismantled chariots, ceremonial beds in the shape of divine animals, and gilded couches stacked like discarded furniture. Amid the chaos, Carter moved slowly, methodically, as if he were walking through the dreams of a long-dead king. The annex, a smaller chamber off to one side, was an even greater puzzle, packed floor to ceiling with jars, baskets, linens, food offerings, unguents, and relics of daily life rendered eternal in their ritual purpose. Carter recorded every item in exhaustive detail, sketching, photographing, cataloguing, and assigning a number. He kept a journal that would later become one of the most valuable historical records in archaeology. The air in these chambers was stale, heavy, thick with the scent of ancient oils and the dust of the ages. Temperatures inside the tomb could reach stifling levels, and yet Carter and his team worked for months, often in near silence, careful not to disrupt the fragile equilibrium of a space that had remained closed for 33 centuries. But it was the burial chamber that truly stopped time. Once the blocking wall was removed, Carter was greeted by a surreal and overwhelming sight, a shrine within a shrine within a shrine, like a Russian doll carved from sacred geometry and ancient purpose. 4 large gilded shrines, each nested inside the other, filled nearly the entire room. These were no mere decorative boxes. They were architectural, their walls covered in spells and images from the Book of the Dead, invocations to the gods, symbols meant to guide the king through the duat, the perilous journey of the afterlife. Inside the innermost shrine was a red quartzite sarcophagus, cracked at one corner from some ancient mishap but still intact. Within that sarcophagus were 3 coffins, each more elaborate than the last, all bearing the visage of the boy king with his serene, ageless features and the ceremonial crook and flail crossed over his chest. The final coffin was solid gold, weighing over 240 pounds, a treasure that even in the modern age would be nearly priceless. It was not greed that filled Carter's eyes, but reverence and awe. Resting inside that final coffin was the mummified body of Tutankhamun himself, adorned with a death mask that would come to symbolize ancient Egypt for generations to come. Crafted of gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli, obsidian and quartz, the mask portrayed a youthful king untouched by time, his expression calm, his gaze unflinching, a bridge between the mortal and the divine. It took nearly a decade to fully document and remove all 5,398 artifacts from the tomb. Carter refused to allow haste or spectacle to compromise the integrity of the work. Each item was carefully wrapped, photographed, and transported for analysis and preservation. There were alabaster jars containing the pharaoh's internal organs, still sealed with resin after 3,000 years. There were bows, arrows, and daggers, including one forged from meteoritic iron. There were sandals sized for a teenager, linen undergarments folded with care, and a lock of hair believed to belong to his grandmother, Queen Tai. Every item told a story, not just of a king, but of a civilization that believed in eternity with such certainty that it had engineered a way to pack for it. But amid the wonder and the methodical labour, a different story began to brew outside the tomb, one not of science or reverence, but of shadows and superstition. As word spread of Lord Carnarvon's sudden death, journalists and sensationalists began whispering of curses, of divine retribution for disturbing the sacred. Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes and a noted spiritualist, publicly speculated that elemental spirits had been summoned to punish the desecrators. Reporters scoured ancient texts and tombs for curse inscriptions. They ignored the scientific explanations, the exposure to bacteria, the chance of infected wounds, and instead built a narrative more palatable to the Gothic sensibilities of the era, a tale in which ancient kings still held dominion over the living, punishing those who dared to pierce the veil. But here, in these early days of discovery, that myth had not yet taken full form. Inside the tomb, Carter pressed on. He was not a man prone to flights of fancy or myth-making. He saw no curse, only the immense responsibility of safeguarding a find that would rewrite history. He was keenly aware that the eyes of the world were upon him, and that any mistake could tarnish not just his reputation, but the legacy of Tutankhamun himself. The Egyptian government too grew increasingly wary. Nationalist fervour was rising in Egypt, and many viewed the excavation as yet another colonial intrusion. The treasures, it was feared, might disappear into foreign museums like so many before them. Tensions mounted between Carter and Egyptian authorities, leading to disputes and suspensions of work. Still, the tomb remained his life's work. He returned year after year, aging in the desert sun, his hands never far from the dust of the dead. And as each item was catalogued and removed, the tomb slowly emptied, its golden glow replaced by scaffolding and shadows, the magic slowly drained like sand through an hourglass. And yet, the myth was only growing stronger beyond the valley. People began to connect dots, to whisper of other deaths, other misfortunes. The discovery of KV-62 had cracked open not only a tomb, but the imagination of a world hungry for magic in an increasingly mechanized age. Soon, the curse would become a story all its own. But for now, here in the dim light of the burial chamber, there was only the rustle of linen wrappings, the scraping of pencils on paper, and the quiet echo of a king's long silence finally being heard. As the tomb of Tutankhamun slowly gave up its treasures to careful hands and reverent scholars beneath the unforgiving Egyptian sun, the world above, distant, hungry, breathless, was already being transformed by the echo of that candlelit revelation. Yes, wonderful things, Carter had said, and indeed they were, but those words did not remain in the tomb. They travelled faster than any artifact, faster than gold or granite could be packed and shipped, faster even than reason, spreading across continents like a spark in dry grass. The newspapers pounced. The Times of London, which had secured exclusive rights to the story through a private deal with Lord Carnarvon, became the gatekeeper of information, publishing serialized updates that stoked the imagination of millions. Images began to appear, grainy black and white photographs of gilded thrones, lotus-shaped beds, alabaster jars, and that haunting, serene golden mask, its eyes fixed on eternity. In an era before television, before the saturation of visual media, these photos were nothing short of miraculous. The tomb, once silent, now spoke through headlines and press clippings, and what it said was intoxicating. The world had never seen such splendour pulled intact from the ancient past. In drawing rooms and schoolhouses, in lecture halls and kitchen tables, the boy king became a household name. Tutankhamun, a figure so obscure that even most Egyptologists had never studied him deeply, was reborn as the pharaoh of the modern world's imagination. And with his resurrection came a fever, a full-blown cultural epidemic. Egyptomania swept the globe like a gust from the desert. Jewelers scrambled to replicate the aesthetic of the treasures being unearthed. Scarab brooches, cobra pendants, cartouche necklaces. Fashion designers drew from the tomb's motifs, creating dresses with lotus patterns and beaded gowns that shimmered like the gilded shrines. Furniture makers incorporated Egyptian columns and sphinx heads into chairs, tables, and sideboards. Even architecture fell under the spell. Cinemas, banks, and apartment buildings adopted Art Deco infused with pharaonic flair, erecting obelisks and decorating entrances with winged sun discs and Horus eyes. In the United States, department stores hosted Egyptian-themed window displays. In Paris, perfumes promised the allure of ancient queens. Hollywood, ever hungry for spectacle, began churning out films inspired by the mystique. Some respectful, most exaggerated, all contributing to the image of Egypt as a land of buried secrets and supernatural danger. And beneath this global enthusiasm was a not-so-subtle colonial undercurrent. The West, having found the past buried under the sands of a colonized land, now claimed it as its own legacy. Museums prepared displays, academics lectured with newfound enthusiasm. Even school children reenacted the tomb's discovery in pageants and plays. The boy king, once forgotten, had become the centre of a global narrative, one that painted ancient Egypt as both majestic and mystical, its science seen as sorcery, its culture as mythic, its history as spectacle. Yet within all this adoration there was tension. Egyptians whose ancestors had built these wonders were largely excluded from the narrative. Western papers spoke of Carter and Carnarvon as though they had uncovered their own family treasure, with native Egyptians appearing only as nameless diggers and porters in the background of photographs. The discovery, while thrilling, exposed the uneven dynamics of cultural ownership, a question that would haunt the story of Tutankhamun long after the tomb had been emptied. But in 1923, these concerns were only faint murmurs against the roar of publicity. As more artifacts emerged from the tomb, daggers made of meteoritic iron, exquisite chairs inlaid with ivory, jars still containing wine, each announcement fueled the flame. Tutankhamun became a symbol of eternal youth, a golden icon of mystery preserved against time. No detail was too small for speculation. His death mask, with its flawless features and delicate inlays, was printed on postcards and souvenirs. His name, once erased from history by successors eager to forget his lineage, was now etched into the public consciousness. There was something deeply resonant in the image of a boy king, briefly powerful, quickly forgotten, but now returned in glory. To a post-World War I generation numbed by loss and change, Tutankhamun became a talisman of lost beauty and immortality. Meanwhile, the media began shaping not just the facts of the discovery, but the emotional landscape in which those facts were received. Reporters speculated on what the treasures meant. They interviewed spiritualists, theologians, Egyptologists, and psychics. Some saw the discovery as proof of ancient magic, others as a warning against pride. And then, as if on cue, death came to knock. When Lord Carnarvon died unexpectedly in Cairo from an infected mosquito bite on his cheek, on the very side, it was whispered, that had been slashed during embalming on Tutankhamun's own mummy, the story took a darker turn. The world, already high on wonder, now tasted fear. And it was delicious. Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and a man fascinated with spiritualism, suggested that ancient elementals had been awakened to punish the desecration. Other writers invented inscriptions never found in the tomb, warnings to the greedy, threats of vengeance. The cobra on the royal brow was no longer just symbolic, it was now an omen. People began to believe not just in a curse, but in a pattern. Other deaths followed, some real, some invented, some coincidental, all folded into the mythos like incense into smoke. The Times was both the source of and the gatekeeper to the truth, but that didn't matter. Other papers, locked out of the official scoop, simply made up their own versions. The myth, once born, grew legs. It moved faster than Carter could correct, faster than scholars could explain. And it was this myth, this spectral force now fused with the discovery, that ensured Tutankhamun's place in history was not merely archaeological but cultural. For every carefully measured journal entry Carter penned, there were 100 fantastical stories swirling in cafes and living rooms, stories of ghosts and curses and riches bought at the cost of human lives. The mummy's curse had not yet solidified into the pop culture trope we know today, but its bones were there, forming in the dark, waiting to be fleshed out by imagination and fear. It was no longer enough that Carter and Carnarvon had opened a tomb. In the eyes of the world, they had opened a door that should have remained shut. And as the treasures of Tutankhamun made their way to the Cairo Museum, guarded and catalogued, their meanings passed and their origins traced, the boy king was not alone. He was accompanied by a new mythology, one not carved into stone but inked into headlines, broadcast across continents, and whispered from one fevered mind to the next. In the years to come, this myth would prove nearly as enduring as the golden mask itself. But for now, in the blazing heat of global attention, the boy king glittered anew, not merely as an echo from the past, but as a mirror held up to the anxieties and dreams of the modern world. As the glow of global fascination swelled in the wake of Tutankhamun's golden resurrection, the story took a sharp and spectral turn, with the sudden death of one of its most central figures, George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, the man who had bankrolled the entire excavation, who had stood beside Howard Carter as they pried open the tomb's sealed door and glimpsed eternity through a candle's flicker. Lord Carnarvon, a quintessential product of British nobility with a love of adventure and a long history of poor health, had never been a robust man. His enthusiasm for Egyptology had been partly inspired by a 1903 car accident in Germany that left him with fragile lungs and chronic pain, a condition that prompted doctors to recommend the dry heat of Egypt as a salve for his condition. And it was this convalescent's curiosity that had led him to become the patron of Carter's long and often fruitless excavation. In November 1922, when he arrived in the Valley of the Kings to witness the results of that improbable final season, he seemed energized, reinvigorated by the thrill of discovery, and bathed in the reflected glory of what would soon become the most famous archaeological find in human history. But glory, as ever, is not without its price. In March of 1923, just months after the tomb was opened, and while the work of cataloguing the artifacts was still in its early stages, Carnarvon suffered a mosquito bite to the cheek. The bite, seemingly innocuous, became infected after he nicked it while shaving. Infection quickly turned to sepsis, and within days his condition deteriorated. He was hospitalized in Cairo's Continental Savoy Hotel, where he succumbed on March 5th, reportedly from pneumonia and blood poisoning. He was 56 years old. The timing was too perfect, too eerie, and too narratively seductive for the world's newspapers to ignore. Almost instantly, his death was linked not to bacteria or bad luck, but to something far older, far darker, a curse. It didn't matter that Egypt in the 1920s had no antibiotics, or that such infections were often fatal. It didn't matter that Carnarvon had been in poor health for decades, or that shaving cuts and infections were common killers before penicillin's debut. What mattered was that a man had entered the tomb of a forgotten pharaoh and had died not long after. The press went wild. The story was too perfect, too cinematic. According to reports, all the lights in Cairo flickered and went out at the exact moment of his death, as if Egypt itself had dimmed in mourning or protest. Simultaneously in England, it was claimed that Carnarvon's beloved dog, Susie, let out a mournful howl and dropped dead. The coincidence, if it was that, sent a shiver across the globe. Writers and spiritualists rushed to explain. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the famed author and prominent spiritualist, declared publicly that Carnarvon's death had likely been caused by elementals guarding the tomb, supernatural agents invoked by ancient priests to protect their sacred dead. Other publications quoted non-existent inscriptions, supposedly carved above the tomb's door, warning that death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's peace. There was, of course, no such inscription found in Cave 62. Carter himself, ever the rationalist, dismissed the idea entirely. He had found no curses, no threats, not even the kind of protective spells that had been occasionally discovered in other tombs. But the myth didn't need facts, it needed feeling. And in that moment, the world was ripe for it. In the wake of World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic, death had become a constant companion to millions. Superstition found fertile ground in grief. A world haunted by loss and disillusionment craved mystery and meaning, even if it meant conjuring ancient retribution from the sand. The idea of a curse transformed Carnarvon's death into a kind of poetic justice, a narrative device through which modernity's trespass into the sacred could be punished, framed, and mythologized. And so, his passing became not just a tragedy, but a harbinger. People began to comb through the dig team's manifest, circling names and watching obituaries, eager to see if the curse would continue to claim its due. Some were convinced it had already begun. Over the years, more deaths would be retroactively folded into the curse's narrative, some natural, some sudden, others wholly fabricated, but none would match the sheer gothic symmetry of Carnarvon's end. It was as though his death had become a kind of spell, one that transformed the scientific into the supernatural, the historical into the legendary. The very idea of the mummy's curse, which had existed before in novels, pulp magazines, and silent films, suddenly had a real world, anchor, and it stuck. In the years that followed, the curse of the pharaohs would become inseparable from the story of Tutankhamun's tomb, an uninvited but permanent guest in the annals of archaeology. But it all began here, in a hotel room in Cairo, with a shaving cut and a mosquito bite, and a man who had once sought treasure and found, instead, a myth that would long outlive him. Lord Carnarvon died without ever seeing the full extent of the tomb's treasures. He did not witness the unveiling of the golden coffin or the discovery of the death mask. He never saw the world transformed by the Egyptomania he had helped ignite. But in death, he became perhaps the most famous victim of the Boy King's supposed wrath, the first link in a chain of events that would bind the modern world to the ancient one with the invisible threads of fear, coincidence, and the ever-seductive power of story. As the whisper of Lord Carnarvon's death travelled through the dust-choked streets of Cairo and out across the wires of telegraphs and the ink-stained sheets of morning newspapers, the legend of the curse began to grow, not as a slow drip of rumour, but as a tidal surge of superstition eagerly fed by the voracious appetite of a public longing for magic in a world that had become too grimly real. The 1920s were a time of strange contrasts. The Great War had ended only a few years earlier, leaving behind the jagged psychic scars of trench warfare, mustard gas, and a generation of young men turned to names on memorial stones. The Spanish flu had claimed tens of millions in its silent sweep across continents, and the sense that death could be sudden, inexplicable, and devoid of meaning hung heavy over the Western world. In that context, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb offered a rare burst of wonder, a story of golden resurrection. But it also offered something else, something darker, more primal, the idea that death still obeyed unseen laws, that ancient justice might yet assert itself across millennia, and that the past could reach up through the sand to tap the living on the shoulder. When Lord Carnarvon died in March of 1923, newspapers across the globe didn't merely report the fact, they constructed an atmosphere. The Times of London, bound by its exclusive arrangement with Carter, offered measured, respectful coverage, but other outlets, especially those excluded from first-hand reporting, were less restrained. They published headlines like "Pharaoh's Curse Kills Explorer" and "Death Comes on Swift Wings to Those Who Disturb the Tomb," blending fact with fiction in a potent cocktail that turned journalism into myth-making. Reporters mined previous works of fiction for language that sounded appropriately ominous, and before long, a phrase purportedly found on the tomb itself, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's rest," began appearing in print, though no such inscription existed in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The story practically wrote itself: a forgotten king, a golden tomb, a desecration, and a death. Add to that the aura of colonial intrusion and the visual imagery of curses carved in ancient stone, and the world had a new, Gothic fascination. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, always a complicated figure who built the most rational detective in literary history, while personally advocating for fairies, seances, and spiritualism, was one of the earliest and loudest public voices to claim that Carnarvon's death was no accident. He suggested that elementals, spirits bound to protect sacred spaces, had been unleashed by the tomb's disturbance. His comments, made to the press and repeated in periodicals, lent a strange credibility to the supernatural theory. Here was the mind behind Sherlock Holmes, speaking earnestly about ancient metaphysics, and the press devoured it. Other writers followed suit. Marie Corelli, a best-selling author and spiritualist in her own right, claimed that she had warned Carnarvon of the curse before he even entered the tomb, citing obscure Arabic manuscripts that she said spoke of a dire fate awaiting those who breached the tombs of the kings. Whether these manuscripts existed was beside the point. The claim was printed, repeated, and believed. Soon, spiritualist publications were conducting their own investigations into the supposed curse, holding seances and channeling messages from the ancient dead. Readers submitted letters claiming premonitions, visions, and dreams. The idea of the curse spread like wildfire, not only because it was dramatic, but because it filled a gap between the ancient and the modern, between the sacred and the scientific, between a rational world and one still haunted by questions too big to ignore. The allure of the supernatural also dovetailed neatly with broader cultural anxieties of the time. The 1920s saw the rise of psychoanalysis, the questioning of religious dogma, and the redefinition of traditional structures in the aftermath of war. Egypt, with its strange gods, its hieroglyphs, and its aura of eternity, became a screen onto which the West could project both its wonder and its dread. And the curse provided a perfect metaphor for the fear that perhaps some things, some powers, some knowledge, were never meant to be unearthed. Within weeks of Carnarvon's death, newspapers began compiling lists of other people who had been involved with the tomb or its contents, and who had died under unusual or premature circumstances. The death of Arthur Mace, one of Carter's colleagues, was listed. So was that of A.C. Merton, Carnarvon's half-brother. Even Howard Carter's own canary was said to have been killed by a cobra, symbol of pharaonic royalty, the very day the tomb was opened, though this tale was likely invented by a reporter. These deaths, unconnected in cause and widely spaced in time, were drawn together by a single, powerful narrative thread. The idea that to disturb the dead was to invite a reckoning. The myth of the mummy's curse had existed long before 1922. It was a staple of Victorian fiction, penny dreadfuls, and silent films. But the death of Carnarvon gave it a heartbeat. It moved from fiction into perceived reality, and once there it rooted itself deeply. Over time, the idea that ancient tombs were protected by curses became a trope so ingrained that even modern portrayals of Egypt, be it in films, cartoons, or tourist trinkets, rarely avoid referencing it. But in 1923, this myth was still molten, still being forged in real time by every article, every speech, every whispered speculation. Carter, for his part, rejected the entire premise. He was a man of science and precision, dismayed by the sensationalism that eclipsed the academic importance of the find. He would later write scathing rebuttals to the idea of a curse, calling it a grotesque misrepresentation of the work being done. But even he could not control the narrative. The myth had slipped its leash. It was now in the hands of the public, a public that wanted to believe. The press, for its part, did not simply report the curse. It fed it, nurtured it, and then sold it back to readers in serialized features, speculative essays, and gripping headlines. It was a masterclass in myth-making through media, and the effects were lasting. Even as the tomb continued to be catalogued and studied, even as scholars painstakingly pieced together the life and death of Tutankhamun, the public remained fixated not on his lineage or his reign, but on the supposed consequences of waking him. In the decades to come, the idea of the pharaoh's curse would become inseparable from the identity of the tomb itself. Tour guides in Egypt still mention it, documentaries still refer to it, and many who visit the Golden Mask in the Cairo Museum feel the chill of that story even if they do not believe it. It is a narrative as enduring as the artifacts themselves, built not from stone or gold, but from fear, imagination, and the irresistible human need to weave story from coincidence. What began with a mosquito bite and a razor nick became a legend, and it did so not by magic, but by ink and rumour, by the longing of a wounded world for mystery, and by the skillful hands of those who knew that sometimes the truth isn't what people remember, it's the story they want to believe. As the ink dried on headlines about Lord Carnarvon's death, and the myth of the mummy's curse solidified like desert stone under the relentless sun, the world's gaze turned toward the living, toward those who had entered the tomb or worked in its shadow, and who had, by accident or design, become cast members in a macabre unfolding drama. The narrative of the curse required more than a single death. It demanded a pattern, a string of fatalities eerie in timing and linked by proximity to the tomb, no matter how tenuous. The press, ever vigilant for its next angle, began compiling names, tracking obituaries, and scouring society columns for any trace of misfortune that could be twisted into a chapter of the curse. The first names to follow Carnarvon into myth were members of Carter's team, including Arthur Mace, a respected Egyptologist who had helped clear the tomb and was one of the key players in cataloguing the thousands of artifacts packed inside its chambers. Mace died in 1928 of pleurisy and pneumonia, a complication of previous health issues, but in the public imagination his death was anything but mundane. It was a delayed strike from the vengeful hand of Tutankhamun. Then there was George J. Gould, an American financier and rail tycoon, who visited the tomb in 1923. Soon after his visit, Gould contracted a fever and died in France, fueling speculation that the curse knew no borders. Though his health had long been in decline, and though infections were a common killer in those days, his death fit the curse's profile neatly enough to be folded in without resistance. Another name that found its way into the litany was that of Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who took the first X-rays of the mummified remains of the boy king. He died in 1924 of a mysterious illness shortly after the scans were completed, a fact that, once again, was stripped of its medical context and placed in the narrative slot labelled Retribution. Captain Richard Bethel, who had served as Carter's secretary and had been present during many of the early excavations, was also claimed by the curse. Bethel died under unusual circumstances in 1929, reportedly found smothered in his bed at an exclusive London club. His death made headlines and raised eyebrows, especially given the role he had played in organising and handling the artefacts shipped back from Egypt. Shortly thereafter, his father, Lord Westbury, threw himself from a window and died by suicide, a tragic event that only deepened the fog of speculation, with some claiming he had been driven mad by the curse or by the accumulation of proximity to those affected by it. These deaths, while real and undeniably tragic, formed the backbone of the curse mythology, even as their causes range from infection to suicide to natural disease. The cumulative effect was a kind of psychological scaffolding. Each new death added another beam to the structure, making it feel more real, more plausible, and more ominous. The names became like talismans, each one proof that the ancient curse was unfolding as foretold, that the boy king's slumber had been violated, and that those responsible were being picked off one by one. Even Carter's inner circle was not spared from public scrutiny. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, and one of the first people to enter the tomb with Carter and her father, lived until 1980. Yet during the peak of the curse's popularity, rumours circulated about her health and supposed misfortunes. Evelyn, who was known for her charm and wit, dismissed the stories, but her proximity to the tomb meant that any scrape, illness, or minor tragedy in her life could be recast as another sign of the curse's slow but inescapable hand. Then there was Carter himself, the eye of the storm. He remained alive and in good health for over 16 years after the tomb's discovery, finally dying in 1939 at the age of 64 from Hodgkin's disease. But rather than being cited as evidence against the curse, his survival was treated as an anomaly, as if the curse had overlooked him or was simply taking its time. Some even claimed that Carter had angered the gods so profoundly that his punishment would be spiritual rather than mortal, that he would be denied peace in the afterlife for his transgressions. The sheer flexibility of the curse narrative made it immune to contradiction. If someone died soon after visiting the tomb, they were a victim of the curse. If they lived for decades, it was proof that the curse could bide its time. If they died young, it was the wrath of the pharaoh. If they died old, it was the final tally. This malleability, this refusal to be falsified, is one of the reasons the myth has endured. It behaves less like a historical claim and more like a folk tale, adjusting itself to fit every available outcome. Even animals were not exempt. As mentioned before, Carter's pet canary was allegedly eaten by a cobra on the day the tomb was opened. A detail reported breathlessly by journalists and embellished over time. Though Carter himself said the bird had been a gift from a friend and had died weeks earlier, the story of the canary and the cobra became iconic, a symbol of ancient royalty striking at the modern intruder. Over the years, the list of supposed victims grew. Some included journalists who had covered the story, museum staff who had handled the artifacts, and even distant acquaintances of the principal dig team. The further removed from the actual event, the more elastic the definition of involvement became. By the 1930s, dozens of names were being cited as proof of the curse, though few had any direct connection to the tomb, and fewer still had died under circumstances that defied explanation. What mattered was not the death itself, but the suggestion, the link, the eerie parallel. It was a cultural Rorschach test. People saw what they wanted to see, and what they wanted was confirmation that the ancient world still had teeth. This parade of deaths, half fact and half fiction, gave the curse its body. Carnarvon's death gave it its heart. The golden mask gave it its face, and the tomb's sealed door, once breached, gave it its voice, a voice that still murmurs in the dark corners of our collective imagination. Whether real or invented, tragic or manipulated, the fates of these men and women became sacrificial offerings to a narrative larger than themselves, one that demanded awe and punishment in equal measure. In the end, it wasn't just a curse on the tomb. It was a spell cast by a world desperate to believe that some forces, however buried, remain too sacred to disturb. While the newspapers amassed their grim rosters of names and autopsies, of mysterious fevers and tragic falls, building a scaffolding of doom atop the golden discovery in the Valley of the Kings, what received far less attention, scarcely a footnote in the grand narrative of divine vengeance and mystical curses, were the names of those who did not die, who lived long, ordinary, or even extraordinary lives after entering the tomb of Tutankhamun. These were the survivors, and they were not few in number. In fact, they were the majority. Yet their stories, so inconvenient to the drama of a curse, were swept aside by the public's preference for patterns, for narrative neatness, for the poetry of retribution. Chief among these forgotten figures was, of course, Howard Carter himself, the man who had discovered the tomb, who had breached its seal, who had stood at the threshold and peered through the tiny hole with that flickering candle and uttered the immortal phrase, "He lived for another 16 years." Carter did not wither away in the Egyptian heat or perish under suspicious circumstances. He died in London in 1939, aged 64, of Hodgkin's disease, a type of lymphoma that, while serious, was a natural cause of death unrelated to cobras, spirits, or ancient vengeance. For a man who had spent decades crawling through tombs, breathing in centuries of dust and decay, it was an entirely unremarkable end. He never married, never found another project that matched the scope or fame of Tutankhamun, but he lived out his days in relative peace, surrounded by books and memories, steadfast in his disbelief in any curse. His refusal to entertain the myth made him a frustrating figure for journalists, and over time he became portrayed as cold, dismissive, even humourless, a man incapable of appreciating the wonder he had unlocked. But the truth was simpler. He saw himself as a steward of the past, not a protagonist in a Gothic novel. His very survival, as the man most associated with the tomb, was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence against the idea of a curse, but it was inconvenient, and so it was often framed as an anomaly or, more poetically, as a man marked for a punishment that never came. Then there was Lady Evelyn Herbert, the daughter of Lord Carnarvon, and one of the first people to step into the tomb's antechamber with Carter and her father. Young, vibrant, and curious, she was the picture of modern aristocratic poise, and she carried with her into that ancient chamber the aura of living myth, an English lady walking through the corridor of the dead. If the curse was to strike anyone, surely it would be her, but it didn't. She lived until 1980, reaching the age of 78, long enough to see her own legacy entangled in the story of the tomb. She gave interviews, attended lectures, and maintained her belief that no curse existed. Her life, though marked by tragedy, the loss of her father, the weight of inherited fame, was not shortened or marred by the tomb. She became, in her own quiet way, a living rebuke to the myth. Similarly, Alan Gardner, the brilliant philologist who helped Carter translate the inscriptions and interpret the texts within the tomb, lived to the age of 84. Gardner's work was instrumental in understanding the rituals and beliefs encoded in the tomb's contents, and his deep dives into the ancient language of the Egyptians pulled meaning from symbols that had slept for centuries. He worked side by side with Carter for years, directly interacting with the artifacts, the walls, the funerary texts, and yet he too lived a long, intellectually rich life. The list continues. Dr. Douglas Derry, the anatomist who first examined the mummy of Tutankhamun, died at the age of 87. He physically handled the remains, was among the first to see the pharaoh's face in thousands of years, and performed the forensic examination that revealed insights into the boy king's physical condition at the time of death. His exposure to the supposedly cursed body did not cut his life short, nor did it harm Percy Newberry, an Egyptologist who had worked with Carter and assisted in the early phases of the dig. He lived to 83. Nor did it harm Harry Burton, the photographer whose iconic images of the tomb's contents brought the treasures to life for a global audience. Burton spent years in and around the tomb, documenting the process with painstaking care, developing photographs in the brutal heat of the valley. His images were so striking, so evocative, that they became as central to the story as the artifacts themselves. He lived to the age of 60, dying of natural causes. These were not peripheral figures. They were not tourists or distant acquaintances. They were the inner circle, the men and women who ate, slept, and breathed the tomb. For years they worked long hours in cramped spaces, touched the treasures with their own hands, inhaled the air that had lain sealed for over 3,000 years. If any curse were real, these people would have been on the front lines. Yet the curse, it seemed, passed them by. Or perhaps, more truthfully, it was never there at all. In 2002, a formal study was conducted by Dr. Mark Nelson and published in the British Medical Journal. He compared the lifespans of the 44 Westerners present in Egypt at the time of the tomb's opening, 25 of whom had entered the tomb, with a control group. The findings were unambiguous. There was no significant difference in life expectancy between those who had entered the tomb and those who had not. If anything, those who had entered the tomb tended to live slightly longer, though not to a statistically meaningful degree. The myth of the curse, so vivid and so pervasive, collapsed under the weight of data, but by then the damage, or perhaps the enchantment, was already done. The public had embraced the narrative, and no amount of evidence could pry it from the imagination. Survivors were not dramatic. They made poor headlines. They lived, and in doing so they dispelled the mystery. But the world, having already chosen magic over math, simply looked the other way. It is a strange phenomenon, this selective blindness, but it speaks to something deep in the human psyche. We prefer stories that reinforce our sense of wonder, our belief in the unseen, our craving for cosmic symmetry. A curse offers meaning. Coincidence does not. And so the survivors of Tutankhamun's tomb became background noise, ignored in favour of the handful of deaths that could be spun into chilling verses. The truth, buried beneath the layers of romanticism and rumour, is that the tomb gave far more life than it took. It launched careers, transformed lives, brought Egyptology into the global spotlight and connected people across cultures and generations through the shared thrill of discovery. But the survivors never graced the front pages. They did not haunt headlines. They lived, they worked, they aged, and they died. Quietly, peacefully, and mostly forgotten by the legend they had helped to write. In the grand theatre of the curse, it seems, life was simply too boring to make the final cut. As the myth of the pharaoh's curse slithered through the collective imagination, fed by tabloids and spiritualists, whispered in salons and gossiped about in universities, the quieter voice of reason, measured, empirical, unglamorous, was barely heard above the din. This was a story sculpted by sensationalism, not scrutiny, and it thrived in a world more eager for mystery than for math, more enchanted by ancient retribution than by statistical probability. In truth, the supposed curse of Tutankhamun was, at its core, a masterclass in psychological projection and media amplification, a narrative scaffolded not by evidence, but by timing, fear, and a profound cultural hunger for enchantment in an increasingly disenchanted age. The moment Lord Carnarvon died, the press set the tone, not with analysis, but with mood. They bathed his death in melodrama, inventing inscriptions, invoking ancient deities, and framing every subsequent misfortune as part of an ancient conspiracy. But there was no consistent methodology to these claims, no agreed-upon criteria for what counted as involvement with the tomb, or how close one needed to be to invoke the curse's wrath. Was it merely entering the tomb? Was handling artifacts enough? Was attending a related lecture sufficient grounds for divine punishment? The parameters shifted with every telling, growing ever more elastic to accommodate new names, new deaths, new coincidences that could be spun into thread for the growing tapestry of terror. Yet in the cold, hard light of statistical inquiry, the pattern dissolves. Even in the earliest decades after the tomb's opening, scholars and skeptics began to push back against the curse narrative. In 1934, Herbert Winlock, director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Egyptian department and a close colleague of Carter's, published a study noting that of the 26 people present at the tomb's unsealing in 1923, only 6 had died within a decade. Most lived far beyond the average life expectancy of the time. More definitive still was the 2002 study led by Dr. Mark Nelson, published in the British Medical Journal, which analysed 44 Westerners involved with the tomb and compared their lifespans to expected mortality rates. The results were conclusive. There was no statistically significant difference between those who had entered the tomb and those who had not. The average lifespan of those who entered was over 70 years, remarkably long given these period standards. The curse, it turned out, had no teeth, only an echo. But facts are rarely as seductive as stories, and in the battle between data and drama, drama usually wins. The problem lies not in numbers, but in human cognition, our innate tendency toward pattern recognition, even when the patterns are illusory. Psychologists call it apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated events. A man visits a tomb and dies months later. Our minds, primed for narrative cohesion, refuse to let it go. Another man lives for decades, untouched by misfortune. Our minds dismiss him as an exception, a statistical fluke, or worse, ignore him entirely. The media capitalized on this instinct, crafting a narrative scaffolded by selective memory and omission. Every unexpected death was amplified, every mundane survival minimized. This is how legends are born, not through malice, but through momentum. And the momentum was fueled not just by headlines, but by the very shape of the 20th century's soul. The curse of the pharaohs flourished in a world disoriented by change. The horrors of World War I had fractured belief in progress and reason. The rise of psychoanalysis had unveiled the unconscious, the hidden currents beneath polite society. The spiritualist movement promised contact with the beyond. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb landed squarely in the middle of these cultural convulsions, offering both wonder and warning. A glittering time capsule from a civilization that believed in eternity, uncovered by a world that no longer knew what to believe. The curse, then, was not just a story about death. It was a story about meaning, about whether the universe punishes hubris, about whether sacred things can be violated without consequence. In this sense, the myth served a psychological function. It made people feel that there were still rules in a ruleless world, that karma might reach across centuries, that desecration would not go unpunished. The scientists, the doctors, the skeptics, they had evidence. But the public had feelings, and in the theatre of public opinion, feelings always get the better seats. Even the absence of a curse inscription in the tomb, a glaring gap in the logic of the myth, did little to dull its power. Other tombs had included warnings, and those warnings were repurposed and retrofitted into Tutankhamun's narrative, as if all pharaohs spoke with one voice, as if the entire civilization were united in its posthumous rage. The fact that Tutankhamun's tomb was, in religious terms, incomplete and hastily assembled made no difference. In the public mind, it was the perfect stage, and so, reason stood in the wings, nodding patiently while the drama played out centre stage. Even now, nearly a century later, the curse remains the more enduring part of the tomb's story. Ask a passerby about Tutankhamun, and they're far more likely to mention the curse than his religious reforms, his burial anomalies, or the iconography of his mask. It's not because the curse is true, it's because it's memorable, simpler, more emotionally resonant, and it leaves behind a trace of awe, that delicious tingle of the uncanny. But buried beneath the superstition is a quieter, more human truth, that the real miracle of the tomb was not death, but survival, not the imagined wrath of gods, but the tangible labour of men and women who spent years preserving a piece of history for the world. They lived, they worked, they documented, and they aged, not as victims of a curse, but as caretakers of a legacy. And in that legacy lies a different kind of magic, one made not of spells or spirits, but of dust, discipline, and the stubborn, beautiful urge to remember. While the myth of the pharaoh's curse continued to grow in the public imagination, fed by coincidence and fear, and the seductive narrative architecture of cause and effect, the actual historical and archaeological record remained remarkably quiet, uncomplicated by supernatural warnings or ominous inscriptions, stubbornly mundane in its truth. The tomb of Tutankhamun, for all its unparalleled splendour and spiritual depth, did not contain a curse. No carved malediction graced the walls. No threats to the living were etched onto the shrines or sarcophagus. No hidden chamber whispered warnings to intruders in hieroglyphic form. And yet, to many, this absence was simply too inconvenient to accept. Over the decades, the legend insisted on a curse, so one was fabricated, imported from other tombs, invented in press rooms, or projected onto the walls by the collective longing for the poetic justice of a wrathful beyond. But in ancient Egypt, curses were not the norm. They were never standard practice, nor were they considered primary defensive mechanisms for royal tombs. The Egyptians, while intensely spiritual and deeply devoted to the rituals of death and the afterlife, relied not on fear but on divine order, the principle of Ma'at to govern both the world of the living and the transition to the next. Tombs were constructed as eternal homes for the dead, and their security was meant to be guaranteed by architectural complexity, hidden entrances, and sheer physical inaccessibility rather than metaphysical threats. Curses, when they did appear, were largely confined to the tombs of nobles, priests, or non-royal individuals, particularly during the Old and Middle Kingdoms. These inscriptions were usually carved at the tomb's threshold and took the form of legal or moral warnings, often invoking divine retribution for disturbing the sacred peace of the dead. They were not magical incantations so much as social contracts, a way to remind would-be thieves or defilers that they risked not just legal repercussions but cosmic ones. An example from the tomb of Kentaka Ikeki in Saqqara reads, "As for all men who shall enter this tomb, impure, there will be judgment. An end shall be made for him by the great God." Another from a tomb in El Kab warns, "Anyone who shall make an evil plan concerning this tomb, the crocodile shall be against him in the water, the snake against him on land. He who shall do this shall have the judgment of the great God." These were moralistic warnings, not supernatural traps, and they reflected the Egyptian belief that the natural and divine orders were entwined, that to disturb the peace of the dead was to invite disorder, and disorder was the ultimate threat to cosmic harmony. But in the Valley of the Kings, especially during the New Kingdom, when Tutankhamun reigned, such inscriptions were exceedingly rare. Royal tombs were built in secrecy, their locations obscured, their entrances buried under tons of rubble. The primary defense was invisibility, not invocation. The very fact that Tutankhamun's tomb remained largely intact for over 3,000 years is a testament to how effective that strategy was. The looters who did find it in antiquity took only a few items before they were presumably interrupted, and the tomb was resealed and forgotten, buried under debris from later construction. When Carter uncovered it, there were no curses waiting for him, only silence, dust, and the scent of ancient incense lingering in the stagnant air. And yet, because the idea of a curse had already taken root, people began to imagine one into being. The supposed inscription, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the king's peace," was never found in KV-62, yet it is now almost universally associated with the tomb. Its origin is likely apocryphal, possibly a creation of novelist Marie Corelli, or one of the many journalists desperate to embellish their stories. Some have suggested it was mistranslated from inscriptions found elsewhere, or misremembered from other funerary texts that spoke not of curses, but of the spiritual journey of the deceased. The Book of the Dead, which adorned many tomb walls and funerary papyri, contains spells and declarations to protect the soul on its journey, not to harm the living. It is a roadmap for resurrection, not a list of threats. There are, to be sure, texts in the Egyptian canon that call down divine punishment on enemies, but these are found in magical papyri, not on tomb walls. They were part of ritual magic, practiced by priests and healers, intended to protect the sick or ward off evil, not to curse grave robbers or archaeologists. In short, The Egyptian religious worldview was fundamentally different from the Gothic one that the curse narrative implies. To them, the afterlife was not a haunted domain jealously guarded by vengeful spirits, but a complex continuation of earthly life, one that required preparation, offerings, and ritual to maintain. The dead needed their tombs to remain intact, not because they would rise and lash out, but because their eternal sustenance, food, prayers, their names spoken aloud, depended on it. A curse would have been a crude and ineffective tool compared to the elaborate architecture of the valley, the spiritual economy of offerings and remembrance, and the practical measures taken to obscure the tomb's location. And yet, once the idea of the curse entered popular consciousness, it refused to leave. People imagined that the very air inside the tomb was charged with malice, that the walls whispered warnings in the night, that invisible forces clung to the artifacts and followed them into museum halls. But the real threat inside the tomb was more mundane. There was the dust, centuries of it carrying mold, spores and bacteria. There was the potential for organic decay, for respiratory distress. And there was the stress, the immense emotional and physical toll of working long hours in a claustrophobic space under global scrutiny in the heat and isolation of the desert. Any illness, any misstep, any untimely death could easily be explained by environmental or psychological factors. But those explanations lacked the allure of the supernatural. They did not sing with the same seductive note. The idea that Tutankhamun's tomb was cursed has persisted for a century, not because it is supported by Egyptian history, but because it fulfills a narrative need. Our need to believe that some things remain sacred, untouchable, protected by forces older than science. It is a projection of modern fear onto an ancient canvas, a ghost story painted in hieroglyphs we don't bother to read. But the truth is clear. There was no curse in the tomb of Tutankhamun. No threat, no warning, no divine promise of vengeance. Just the remnants of a boy king's brief life, carefully preserved for a journey he never got to complete. And perhaps in that silence, in that absence, there lies a more profound kind of message. Not a curse, but a reminder. That history is not always what we wish it to be. That the past does not always speak in riddles or omens. Sometimes it simply waits, buried in the dust, for someone to listen closely enough to hear the truth. While the myth of the curse tightened its grip on the popular imagination, curling like incense through the drawing rooms of Europe and drifting across the newsprint of every major newspaper, behind it lay something even more ancient than tombs, more powerful than spirits, and more enduring than pharaohs: money. For all its supernatural overtones, the story of Tutankhamun's curse is inextricably entwined with commerce, publicity, and the economic incentives that propelled it forward. The early 20th century was a golden age not just for archaeology, but for storytelling, and few things sold better than mystery wrapped in history. The curse offered the perfect product. It was exotic, dramatic, and uncannily well-timed. And for the institutions and individuals involved in the tomb's discovery and dissemination, the myth became an unexpected marketing boon. Let us begin with the press. Lord Carnarvon, ever the businessman even amid his archaeological idealism, had struck an exclusive agreement with the Times of London for coverage of the tomb's discovery. This deal granted the Times unparalleled access to Carter and his findings, while freezing out rival publications. It was at the time a radical and somewhat controversial move, Other newspapers were furious, not just because they were denied first-hand reporting rights, but because it created a media vacuum that had to be filled with something. And so, with no access to factual updates or first-hand images, many papers simply made up their own stories. They speculated, they invented, they dramatized. When Lord Carnarvon died, the Times issued a restrained obituary. The other papers, however, pounced. The Daily Mail, the New York Times, and countless tabloids and broadsheets ran headlines proclaiming the wrath of the pharaoh, spinning Carnarvon's mosquito bite into divine retribution. The more outrageous the headline, the more papers sold. Spiritualists gave interviews, psychics issued warnings, illustrators rendered scenes of ghostly avengers rising from golden sarcophagi, and behind it all, the cash registers rang. Every cursed death became a fresh opportunity for copy. Every new name connected to the tomb was an excuse to reprint the story with new flair. In this way, the myth became economically self-sustaining, a story that paid for itself with each retelling. Meanwhile, the Carnarvon estate, having lost its patriarch, found that his sudden and mysterious death added a strange kind of value to the discovery. While the Earl's passing was a personal tragedy, it also cemented his place in history, casting him as a tragic figure, a noble sufferer of the ancient god's wrath. His death became a story element, a symbol of romantic sacrifice in the pursuit of knowledge. The estate, with its ties to Highclere Castle, later known as the filming location for Downton Abbey, found renewed public interest. Visitors were drawn not just by the architectural splendour of the family seat, but by the lingering aura of pharaohs and curses. Even today, Highclere runs exhibitions dedicated to its Egyptian connections, profiting from the myth that grew in its drawing rooms a century ago. The museums too saw their fortunes change. The artefacts from the tomb were destined for the Cairo Museum, and as they were gradually prepared for display, public interest surged. Tourists arrived in droves, and museums around the world scrambled to mount their own Egypt-themed exhibitions. Items tangentially related to Tutankhamun were framed as cursed relics. Replicas were produced and sold. Gift shops stocked an array of merchandise, amulets, postcards, and eventually, in later decades, action figures and board games. The curse became not a warning, but a brand. Even Hollywood couldn't resist. The first major mummy film, The Mummy, 1932, starring Boris Karloff, leaned heavily on the themes of ancient vengeance and the dangers of desecrating sacred tombs. Though the film bore little resemblance to the actual story of Tutankhamun, it was clearly inspired by the cultural milieu that his tomb had created. The notion of the mummy's curse became a fixture in pop culture, echoed in comics, radio dramas, pulp novels and cartoons. Each iteration strayed further from historical reality, but each contributed to a feedback loop of intrigue and revenue. The legend paid dividends. Beyond the media, the curse narrative also served to justify and obscure uncomfortable questions about colonialism. Western powers had long been removing artifacts from Egypt, often under dubious agreements or outright looting. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb came at a time when Egypt was asserting more control over its antiquities, leading to tensions between Carter's team and Egyptian officials. The curse story helped redirect attention. Rather than focusing on the ethical complexities of removing sacred items from a colonized land, the narrative shifted toward the exotic, the thrilling, the tragic. the curse allowed the Western public to continue enjoying the fruits of empire while convincing themselves they had merely stumbled into a haunted temple. It was a powerful diversion, one that obscured the real injustices beneath a veil of mystical vengeance. Carter himself, while never endorsing the curse, understood its utility. He was fiercely protective of the tomb, meticulous in his documentation and acutely aware of the world's eyes upon him. Though he denied the curse's reality, he also didn't campaign particularly hard to dispel it. He preferred the work to speak for itself, and if the myth helped keep the spotlight fixed on the tomb, so be it. His focus remained on the preservation and interpretation of the treasures, but he must have recognized that the public's fascination owed as much to the ghost story as to the gold. Over time, the economic engines powered by the curse grew ever more sophisticated. By the 1970s, when the Treasures of Tutankhamun travelling exhibition made its way to London, Paris, and the United States, the Boy King's mask had become one of the most iconic images in the world. Millions stood in line for hours just to glimpse it. The exhibitions generated tens of millions of dollars in revenue for museums, and every brochure, banner, and audio tour leaned into the legend. Some even included references to the curse, cheekily acknowledging the myth without endorsing it, knowing full well that it added spice to the visit. And so, the story endured. Not just because it was compelling, but because it was profitable. The myth of the curse did not survive despite economic forces. It survived because of them. It was a story with legs because it sold papers, sold tickets, sold trinkets. It filled theatres and museum halls. It softened the edge of imperialism and made the foreign feel thrilling instead of troubling. And in doing so, it became a permanent fixture in the tale of Tutankhamun. But beneath the commerce, beneath the headlines and the ghost stories, there still lies the tomb, silent, golden, filled with echoes. The truth, patient and unprofitable, remains buried under a century's worth of superstition, waiting for those willing to dig a little deeper, not for treasure, but for understanding. Because the real legacy of Tutankhamun is not in the curse that never was, but in the dazzling complexity of a world that was, and the strange, sometimes cynical, always fascinating ways in which the modern world has chosen to remember it. As the dust of the initial discovery settled and the golden contents of Tutankhamun's tomb were catalogued piece by painstaking piece, the world looked to one man for the story behind it all, Howard Carter, the archaeologist who had unearthed not just a burial site but an entire mythos. He was a man forged in discipline, hardened by years of failure and funded ambition, and possessed of a meticulous mind that valued order, precision, and above all, control. In many ways, Carter was the perfect steward for the tomb's contents. In others, he was their gatekeeper in the most literal sense, shaping not just how the treasures were handled, but how the story of the tomb would be told for generations. His diaries, notebooks, and formal publications became the official record of the find, and through them, Carter guided the narrative arc with the same attention to detail that he applied to his field work. But behind that narrative, carefully curated and broadly accepted, were omissions, tensions, and choices that spoke less to conspiracy than to a deeper, more nuanced reality, one in which archaeology was as much performance as it was science, and in which the narrator, like any other, had a vested interest in how the tale was received. Carter's account of the tomb's opening is now legendary. The small breach in the doorway, the candle held up to peer through the hole, the famous words, "Yes, wonderful things." Yet this poetic moment, however real in essence, was rehearsed, sharpened, and repackaged for public consumption. The process of discovery was not a single event, but a staggered unfolding that took weeks and months. The tomb was not pristine. It had been entered in antiquity at least twice, and signs of looting were evident in the disarray of certain chambers. But Carter emphasized the tomb's intactness because it lent the find a kind of miraculous purity, a narrative of untouched antiquity that the press and public devoured. The reality that the tomb was modest in size, hastily constructed and partially looted, was downplayed in favour of the more romantic notion of a sleeping king guarded by silence and sand. This wasn't exactly deception, but it was narrative refinement. The need to protect the tomb, the excavation process, and his own position led Carter to be highly selective in what was revealed and when. His notes were precise, but his public statements were often guarded. Tensions with Egyptian authorities grew as the years wore on, especially as debates over the ownership and distribution of the artifacts intensified. The Egyptian government, under increasing nationalist pressure, wanted the treasures to remain in Egypt, while Carter and others had hoped for a division of finds in the British tradition. This conflict led to accusations of smuggling and impropriety. Rumours swirled that Carter had helped himself to small items from the tomb, rings, amulets, beads, before formal cataloguing could begin. Though never proven, these rumours gained traction, especially when, decades later, artifacts believed to originate from Tutankhamun's tomb were found in the collections of Carter's acquaintances or quietly returned to Egyptian authorities. The most famous example is a gold and blue faience headrest fragment that was reportedly identified in a private British collection, traced back to Carter's circle. While such items may have been taken as tokens or study pieces during a period when archaeological norms were looser than today's strict regulations, their existence suggests that the boundary between excavation and possession was not always clear, even to Carter himself. Beyond the physical artifacts, Carter also controlled the interpretive frame. His publications were comprehensive, yet they reflected the biases and assumptions of his time. Tutankhamun was framed as a minor, almost accidental king, important only because of the tomb's contents, not because of any historical significance. His connections to the tumultuous Amarna period were only dimly understood, and Carter had little interest in exploring the religious and political upheaval of the era. He focused instead on the material, the art, the craftsmanship, the symbolic arrangements of the objects. In doing so, he preserved the tomb as a static tableau, a museum exhibit rather than a chapter in a turbulent dynastic saga. This focus shaped generations of Egyptological interpretation, and only in recent decades have scholars begun to piece together a more complex portrait of Tutankhamun, not as a footnote, but as a king whose short reign marked a crucial transition in Egyptian history. Carter also had complicated relationships with his team and patrons. His collaboration with Lord Carnarvon was effective but occasionally strained. After Carnarvon's death, Carter became the sole authority on the tomb, but without his benefactor's political leverage, he clashed more openly with Egyptian officials. He temporarily walked away from the excavation in 1924 during a dispute with the Antiquities Service, and was only reinstated after a negotiated compromise. These political frictions, largely absent from his official narratives, reveal the unstable foundation upon which the tomb's discovery rested. an uneasy alliance of imperial ambition, personal ego, and national pride. Carter's legacy was further shaped by the posthumous publication of his journals and field notes. These documents, though invaluable to historians, show the gap between his internal observations and his public statements. They reveal his frustrations, his moments of doubt, and his occasional disdain for bureaucratic interference. They also hint at the weight he carried, the pressure to honour the discovery, to preserve its integrity, and to manage the global hysteria that surrounded it. Carter was not merely an archaeologist. He had become a symbol, a conduit through which the ancient world flowed into the modern, and with that status came enormous responsibility and scrutiny. In the end, Carter's shaping of the tomb story was neither wholly innocent nor entirely manipulative. It was the product of a man caught between worlds, between science and spectacle, between colonial entitlement and emerging nationalism, between private ambition and public myth. He preserved Tutankhamun's treasures with extraordinary care and precision, but in doing so, he also curated a narrative that fit the needs of his time, omitting complexities that might have muddied the romance. Today, scholars continue to revisit the original records, recontextualizing the tomb within broader historical, religious, and political frameworks. New technologies, CT scans, DNA testing, and digital imaging, offer insights Carter could never have imagined. And yet, his fingerprints remain on every interpretation. He was the first to see those wonderful things, and in telling the world what he saw, he ensured that the story would endure, if not exactly as it happened, then at least as it was needed. And perhaps, in the end, that is what all great discoverers do. Not just unearth the past, but shape the story by which it is remembered. As the romantic veneer of the Pharaoh's curse slowly began to wear thin under the scrutiny of skeptics and scientists, another explanation crept quietly into the conversation, one grounded not in the metaphysical but in the microbial, a world just as ancient and invisible as any priestly curse, but infinitely more plausible. The idea that the tomb of Tutankhamun might have posed real biological dangers to its intruders was not considered at first, not seriously. After all, in the 1920s, the understanding of microbiology was still in its adolescence, and the concept of invisible pathogens laying dormant for thousands of years only to awaken in defense of a dead king sounded at the time like a new brand of horror fiction. Yet the deeper one looks into the physical conditions of the tomb, its contents, its air quality, its sealed environment, the more reasonable this hypothesis becomes. Tomb KP 62 had been sealed for over 3,300 years, a dark, stagnant environment carved into the limestone bedrock of the Valley of the Kings. It was filled with organic material, wood, textiles, food offerings, resins, oils, and most significantly, a human body. While the ancient Egyptians practiced embalming with extraordinary care, the preservation of Tutankhamun's mummy was notably compromised. The body had been overtreated with resins during mummification, possibly in a rushed attempt to bury the young king quickly after his unexpected death. The excessive application of these unguents and oils, combined with the heat of the tomb and the airtight seal, caused a kind of slow cooking effect. Carter himself noted that the mummy was essentially glued into its coffin, stuck in place by the congealed mess of liquefied resin. The body had blackened, degraded, and partially disintegrated. The conditions inside the tomb were not just uncomfortable, they were biologically volatile. Inside that sealed microclimate, bacteria and fungi would have thrived, feeding off the moisture, the organic offerings, the decomposing body. When Carter and his team first entered, they disturbed an equilibrium that had remained untouched for millennia, releasing into the air a soup of particles that no living creature had inhaled in over 3,000 years. Among the most cited culprits in the scientific explanation of the curse are molds like Aspergillus flavus, a common fungus that can grow on organic materials in damp, dark environments. Aspergillus flavus produces aflatoxins, which are highly toxic and carcinogenic compounds capable of causing severe respiratory illness, liver damage, and in high concentrations, death. Other molds such as Stachybotrys chartarum, sometimes sensationally referred to as black mold, and Penicillium species are also known to produce airborne mycotoxins under the right conditions. If any of these were present inside the tomb, and studies suggest they likely were, then those first few breaths taken by Carter, Carnarvon and others may have been deeply hazardous. The symptoms of mold-induced illness can be insidious and non-specific: fatigue, difficulty breathing, inflammation, allergic reactions, fever. For a man like Lord Carnarvon, already in compromised health due to his previous injuries and chronic lung conditions, even a modest fungal exposure could have tipped the scales. A mosquito bite, minor infection, or general fatigue could have combined with mold exposure to create a cascade of symptoms that, in the absence of antibiotics or accurate diagnostics, would have seemed mysterious and sudden. And in that vacuum of understanding, the idea of a curse found its foothold. Modern forensic analysis has lent further credibility to the mold theory. In other tombs and burial chambers, scientists have detected viable spores even after thousands of years, a testament to the durability of certain fungal species. A study conducted in the 1990s by microbiologists examining tombs in both Egypt and South America revealed the presence of toxic molds and bacteria capable of surviving in low oxygen, high humidity environments. These findings suggest that ancient tombs, far from being merely dusty time capsules, can function as slow-brewing petri dishes, incubators of invisible threats just waiting to be disturbed. And it wasn't just molds. The air in the tomb may have carried other biological contaminants: bacteria, decayed proteins, ammonia, and hydrogen sulfide gas, all byproducts of organic decomposition. Imagine stepping into a hermetically sealed space where every breath contains trace elements of centuries-old decay. Without protective equipment, respirators, or even the basic knowledge of what dangers might lurk in that air, the early excavators walked blind into an environment that no modern safety standards would deem acceptable. They wore suits and pith helmets, not biohazard gear. They opened sealed canopic jars, unwrapped linens, and handled human remains with bare hands, inhaling spores and particles as they worked. In hindsight, it seems remarkable not that someone died, but that more of them didn't. To be clear, none of this confirms that Carnarvon or any other individual died specifically because of mold exposure. The evidence remains circumstantial, but it offers a compelling, scientifically grounded counterpoint to the curse narrative, one that explains the physical symptoms observed, aligns with known health risks of tomb work, and requires no invocation of ancient wrath. It reframes the curse not as supernatural vengeance but as an occupational hazard, a tragic consequence of exposure to environments that had been sealed from the ecosystem for millennia. And yet, this explanation, while rational and rooted in science, lacks the drama and resonance of the supernatural. Mold doesn't inspire awe. Fungi don't sell newspapers. There's no poetic justice in respiratory illness. So while the microbial theory has gained acceptance among scholars and health professionals, it has never managed to displace the curse in the public's mind. The legend remains because it speaks to something deeper, our need to assign meaning to misfortune, to see cause where there is only chance, to imagine justice where there is only biology. But in that sealed tomb, filled with the perfume of ancient oils and the dust of decaying offerings, the real danger may not have been a curse at all. It may have been the simplest, most overlooked force of all, life itself, microscopic, invisible, persistent, waiting for centuries in silence, awakened not by magic, but by the breath of a man holding a candle in the dark. Even as the dust of ancient superstition slowly settled and rational explanations gained ground, a new wave of inquiry emerged, not to dismiss the idea that the tomb posed real danger, but to reinterpret that danger through the lens of modern science. While fungi, molds, and bacteria offered plausible culprits, some researchers began asking whether there might be even stranger forces at play, hidden not in the spiritual realm but in the molecular, geological, and radiological fabric of the tomb itself. Among the more recent and intriguing theories is the possibility that radiation, not mysticism, may have played a role in the strange deaths and illnesses attributed to Tutankhamun's discovery. In 2024, British researcher Ross Fellows published work suggesting that naturally occurring radiation, specifically from radioactive elements present in the rocks and surrounding soil of the Valley of the Kings, may have created hazardous microenvironments within tombs like KV62. While the idea might sound sensational, it rests on well-established geological facts. Egypt's eastern desert, like many geologically active regions, contains pockets of granite and monazite, minerals known to harbour trace amounts of uranium, thorium, and potassium-40. Over thousands of years, these elements decay and release ionizing radiation. Normally, this process poses little threat in open environments, but in a sealed, unventilated tomb, where walls are thick, the air is still, and exposure could be prolonged, the possibility arises that small but chronic radiation doses might have accumulated to levels capable of harming human health, especially in the form of cumulative biological stress over time. Fellows posits that this radiation, though weak by industrial or medical standards, could still have generated measurable health effects, particularly in those with pre-existing conditions or weakened immune systems. His theory is partly supported by the peculiar physical symptoms some early tomb entrants exhibited: fatigue, skin irritation, persistent coughs, headaches, symptoms often dismissed as mere travel illness, but also consistent with mild radiation exposure. The hypothesis also offers a possible explanation for the uncanny sense of disorientation reported by multiple visitors to sealed tombs, an eerie, heady sensation of airlessness or malaise, as if the atmosphere itself were altered. This feeling, while subjective, has been noted across multiple excavations and might hint at low-level radiation or chemical shifts in the microclimate caused by mineral decay. Compounding this theory is the possibility that some of the resins, oils and pigments used in ancient burial practices, particularly those used to coat or preserve Tutankhamun's body and artifacts, may have chemically broken down over time, releasing toxic vapours. The over-application of embalming resins, which led to the partial incineration of the pharaoh's body, inside the sarcophagus due to a chemical reaction with oxygen and heat suggests that ancient funerary preparations had unintended consequences. Some scholars have proposed that volatile organic compounds, VOCs, created by the breakdown of oils, resins, and preservatives, especially when trapped in a sealed space, could create a toxic atmospheric cocktail capable of irritating lungs and mucous membranes, impairing cognition, or in extreme cases causing long-term health effects. These compounds include substances such as formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, and acrolein, all known to be hazardous in poorly ventilated conditions. The presence of arsenic-based pigments and heavy metals in some tomb paints and funerary cosmetics adds yet another layer of possible toxicity. In this view, the curse was not spiritual vengeance, but a slow exhalation of chemistry, the ancient world releasing its poisons into the breath of the modern. Critics of these theories caution that evidence remains circumstantial. No direct measurement of radiation levels in KV62 during the 1920s exists, nor were environmental samples taken at the time of discovery that could confirm the presence of toxic compounds. But subsequent studies of similar tombs and desert environments have found low but notable levels of radon and gamma radiation, particularly in areas with dense granite exposure. These findings lend credence to the idea that radiation could have contributed, perhaps subtly, perhaps fatally, to the myth that followed in the tomb's wake. And what's perhaps most compelling about these newer theories is that they don't aim to debunk the curse, they aim to reinterpret it. In this light, the ancient Egyptians' focus on purification, ventilation, and ritual cleanliness wasn't just symbolic but practical. They may have known, intuitively or through experience, that disturbing the dead could lead to illness, even if they lacked the vocabulary of microbes or molecules to explain why. The rituals, the incense, the spells, they were not just magical acts but public health measures, spiritualized by the culture but rooted in the recognition that tombs were dangerous. Even the ancient Egyptian word for a tomb, Purjet, translates roughly to House of Eternity, a place meant for eternal rest, not return. The very architecture of the tombs, complex winding corridors, chambers sealed behind heavy stone, suggests an understanding that what lay within should remain undisturbed, not merely out of reverence but perhaps because it was hazardous. That the hazards turned out to be microbial or radiological rather than mystical does not diminish the caution. In fact, it makes the ancient worldview seem even more sophisticated, and so we are left with an unexpected twist in the tale. The modern scientific reinterpretation of the curse does not dispel its eerie resonance. It amplifies it. Because it suggests that the ancient tombs were indeed dangerous, that death did indeed await those who entered, but not because a pharaoh cast a spell. It was because the earth itself, with its invisible isotopes, its ancient spores, and its volatile chemicals, had been lying in wait. The curse, then, is not a metaphor. It is real, just not in the way we once imagined. It is the breath of time, the slow poison of sealed centuries, the revenge of a world never meant to be opened, speaking not in threats carved on stone, but in the molecular language of decay. And in that realization lies a different kind of awe, no less powerful, no less humbling. Because sometimes the truth is stranger than the myth, and far more dangerous. Despite the centuries of dust swept away, the careful cataloguing of every gilded object, The volumes of forensic and scientific literature that now surround the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, the myth of the curse refuses to die. It lingers in museum whispers, in late-night documentaries, in the hushed tone with which docents speak of Lord Carnarvon's final hours. It animates Halloween costumes and pulp horror movies. It slips like a shadow across every golden photograph of the Boy King's death mask, every replica trinket sold in museum gift shops. And the question must be asked, why? Why does the curse endure, not in spite of science, but alongside it, entwined, symbiotic, impervious to debunking? The answer lies not in Egypt, nor in the tomb, nor in anything the ancients wrote or carved. It lies in us, our psychology, our culture, and our eternal hunger for meaning. The human mind is hardwired for narrative. We crave stories with structure, with cause and effect, with tension and resolution. The idea of a curse provides a neat moral architecture. Violate the sacred and you will be punished. It appeals to our sense of justice, to the belief that the universe is ordered, that actions have consequences. When Carnarvon died after entering the tomb, the story wrote itself. It offered a satisfying emotional symmetry, a transgression met with retribution. In a world increasingly shaped by randomness and mechanized violence, such as that which emerged from the trenches of World War I, the notion that some older, more personal justice still operated in the background was deeply appealing. But the endurance of the curse is not just psychological, it's archetypal. The idea of the sacred tomb, protected by mystical forces, reaches far beyond Egypt. It resonates with global myths: Pandora's box, the Ark of the Covenant, the sealed cave of Ali Baba. We are conditioned, culturally, to believe that some things are not meant to be opened, that there are forbidden spaces whose violation invites doom. The tomb of Tutankhamun, sealed for over 3,000 years, was the perfect vessel for this archetype. Its real-world existence gave shape and weight to a trope already embedded in our collective unconscious. And then there's the simple, irrepressible allure of the exotic. For the West in the 1920s, Egypt was not just ancient, it was otherworldly. Its gods had animal heads, its language was unreadable, its funerary customs macabre and majestic. The tomb, with its walls painted in spells, its coffins nested like ritual dolls, its golden effigies of gods and pharaohs, seemed designed to provoke both awe and unease. When the story of the curse entered the public domain, it did so in a context already primed to see the foreign as magical and potentially malevolent. Orientalist attitudes painted non-Western cultures as mystical, dangerous, unknowable, and the myth of the curse fit these prejudices like a glove. It became a way for Western audiences to simultaneously romanticize and fear the East, to elevate its relics while denying its modern agency. Even the academic and scientific community, ostensibly committed to truth over legend, has at times participated in the preservation of the myth. The curse has utility. It draws attention, funding, foot traffic. Museums lean into it with a wink and a nudge, including it in brochures and placards, not as fact but as flavour. It adds spice to an exhibit, creates emotional tension, fuels curiosity. For educators and curators alike, the myth is a hook, a way to engage the public, to turn ancient history into living drama. And while it is often followed by a debunking, that act of debunking only reinforces the myth's presence. It acknowledges it, preserves it in the act of refutation. In this way, the curse becomes a kind of cultural software, patched and reinstalled with every retelling. The media too plays its part. The story of a curse is evergreen. It demands no updates, only repetition. Every anniversary of the tomb's discovery brings new articles, new retrospectives, new op-eds pondering whether the deaths were really so coincidental. TV specials restage the discovery with dramatic music and ominous narration. Podcasts delve into the mystery with an air of half-skeptical wonder. The digital age has not erased the curse, it has globalized it. Now the myth reaches into classrooms, YouTube algorithms and Instagram reels. It has become viral, a cultural artifact as enduring as the mask itself. And still, beneath all this there is something more tender, more human. The curse endures because we are haunted by death. Tutankhamun was a boy, a teenager buried with the full regalia of kingship, his youth forever mummified, his dreams unreadable. His story evokes not just fascination but pathos. He died young. His tomb was sealed hastily, his memory nearly erased. To disturb such a resting place feels, even now, like a moral trespass. The curse gives form to that unease. It says, "We know we should not have looked. We know we took too much." The deaths of Carnarvon, Mace, Bethel, and others give us the illusion that the past punished us for our greed. That, at least in some small poetic way, the world made sense. That there are boundaries which even science must respect. And so the curse remains, not as a literal belief for most, but as a kind of cultural ghost, flickering at the edge of our rational minds. We do not believe it, and yet we tell it, we share it, we remember it, we need it. Because some part of us will always wonder if the dead remember being disturbed, if the air inside a tomb carries more than just mould and dust, if the silence of centuries holds something that should not be spoken aloud. Not because it is dangerous, but because it is sacred. And perhaps that more than anything is what the curse truly is. A story we tell to remind ourselves that some silences deserve to be left intact. And so, as we dust ourselves off from the golden corridors of Tutankhamun's tomb and step back from the long shadow it has cast over both history and imagination, we are left with more than a boy king and his splendid afterlife, more even than a myth about curses and coincidences. What we are left with is a mirror, a reflection of our desire to find patterns where there are none, to infuse meaning into the unknowable, and to drape ancient silence with the fabric of modern storytelling. We've wandered together through the real tomb, the hot, airless stone hollowed out of the Valley of the Kings, cluttered with beds shaped like divine beasts, alabaster jars still sealed with resin, sandals sized for a teenager. We've seen the care with which Howard Carter catalogued every item, the precision, the reverence, the weary joy. We've watched as Lord Carnarvon fell ill, his death reinterpreted not by doctors, but by dreamers, his fate plucked from medical charts and rewritten in hieroglyphs of vengeance. We've listened as the newspapers fanned the flames, as Conan Doyle summoned spirits, as the public clutched pearls and passed the story along, first in gaslit parlours, then in theatres, then in classrooms and museum exhibits and search bars. We've counted the so-called victims, seen how easily tragedy becomes prophecy, how grief invites pattern, how mortality dresses up as mythology. And we've stood beside the ones who lived, the many who left the tomb in good health and long life, whose names faded not because they didn't matter, but because survival is less poetic than punishment. We've held the lens of science to the stones, examined the moulds, the fungi, the volatile compounds and stray wisps of radiation, and realized that the tomb may indeed have had its dangers, that Tutankhamun's breathless chamber could kill, not with wrath but with rot, not with spells but with spores. And yet, even knowing all this, the curse endures, not because it's true, but because it's true in another way. It's true in the way legends are true, the way dreams are true, the way a collective wish becomes something more solid than fact. The curse endures because we need it to. We need the idea that some things remain sacred, that the dead might whisper back, that opening the wrong door might still carry consequences, even in an age of reason. Because when we look into the gold and lapis eyes of that death mask, we're not just seeing a boy king, we're seeing the ancient part of ourselves, the part that wonders, that fears, that hopes there is more, that the past is not dead, that the world, despite all our measurements, is still filled with wonder and warning in equal measure. And if we're lucky, maybe, just maybe, that wonder will outlive us too. If you're still with me, somewhere in the dark, headphones on, eyes closed, thank you for spending your night in the Valley of the Kings. I hope you found it as curious and comforting as I did. Please remember to like and subscribe so these stories can find their way to other sleepless souls. And hey, if you're still awake, congratulations. That's either a sign of a restless mind or one deeply soothed by the ancient dead. Either way, I'm honoured. Good night. This has been The Midnight Inquiry.